Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast. It is 2023, first podcast of the new year. All right, today we're going to remember Pope Benedict, the most influential pope on A Simple House and Laura and I. We're going to talk about what is the purpose of the church and the new seminarians we're getting at Simple House. And then we're going to start a new segment we're going to experiment around with, simple living hacks. Laura, where are you coming from today, Laura?
I'm in my home in Hyattsville, and this might be the second to last podcast I record here. So,
moving
very far away.
Oh man, to an undisclosed location,
a mile and a tenth away from here.
Okay, I'm sitting here in my cold garage, as always. Welcome, everybody, to the podcast. Let's talk about Pope Benedict. I think we're going to do this in three parts. We're going to do a flyover of Pope Benedict's life, and then we're going to talk about what we think are his major works and thoughts, and then we're going to talk about legacy issues, like the way people view him, the stereotypes around him, things like that, and then we'll move on. So he would have been a kind of a young teenager in World War II. He did get assigned to some type of artillery unit. They didn't fire, I think is what he said, when it was at the very end of the war when the Germans were throwing, almost young children to the front lines trying to figure out how to defend the country as it was collapsing. After that, he spent a minute in a POW camp, and I never really heard him mention this as a huge formative experience in his life, but I think just the way JP2, like kind of coming from a communist country, was very important, and him having experienced this young was very formative. He then went to Vatican II, not just as like a junior participant, but actually as a theological consultant. After that, he wrote his great book we're going to talk about, Introduction to Christianity, and he's kind of one of the preeminent Vatican II theologians.
Yeah.
In the 70s, we had a bunch of popes, including John Paul I and then John Paul II. And under John Paul II's pontificate, he became the prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, right?
Yep.
Which has to do with teachings of the church. A very interesting time to have that job in this kind of post-Vatican II confusion, trying to create clarity with JP2. Yeah. I've heard from people that he met with JP2 almost every single day.
Yeah.
I kind of wondered if I should fact check that, and I can't even figure out a way to fact check that, but that's what I'd always heard.
Yeah.
This is also a period when we got the new Catechism. When it first came out, it was in this like tan book. It was like the beta version. And then it kind of came out in this green book when it was more official. And he was the editor of that. We know that from his interviews. And it's pretty interesting, his thoughts on that, Yeah. So what we think of as a modern day catechism is very heavily influenced by Pope Benedict. Right. What's also interesting about this period to me is this lead up to him being Pope, is that JP2 had Parkinson's. And my father had Parkinson's, and he passed away about 2 months ago. And my dad had Parkinson's for like over 20 years. And in final stage Parkinson's, you lose your ability to think, basically. Like it kind of become dementia is part of Parkinson's in the final stages. And we know JP2 had Parkinson's probably as long as my dad did. Right.
But when you say the final stages, like for your father, that was like maybe the second half of him having the disease? Or?
I'd say the final 25%. Like
the final 25%.
If you look up Parkinson's, you're really not supposed to live past 20 years with it. My dad did. But like I'd say the last 5 years, I'd say he was mentally compromised before the last 5 years, but he'd still say brilliant things occasionally. But I'd say in the last 5 years, he like didn't recognize me anymore. You know? Or family members. Like he kind of could have a conversation. Like if you mentioned names, he might know who you were. The last couple of years, he didn't even know that. Right.
Wow.
The point is that the Vatican never came out and said, hey, John Paul II is mentally compromised. Right. We just don't know. We could have been in a situation like we are now with Joe Biden, where you just hope he has good support staff because you don't trust him to be making all these decisions. And then the support staff has to come out and like roll back some of the things he said. But we never had anything really embarrassing happen there. But we may have had a point where the actual Pope didn't have the ability to really hold the reins.
Right.
And his person next to him during that time would have been Cardinal Ratzinger, right? So when Cardinal Ratzinger becomes Pope, he kind of says, he foreshadows a couple things. One, JP2 was a different type of Pope. JP2 the Great, Saint JP2. He was a different type of Pope because he was way beyond the office. Like he was a personality and he was the Pope. Yeah. And he traveled. He just did all these things that were very much like him as a person, in addition to just him as the functions he needed to perform. Yeah. Right. And Pope Benedict was kind of like, I'm just not that. I'm sorry. I'm just can't do that. You know, I'm not.
He said he wouldn't be traveling. Like that was one of the specific things he said, right? He wouldn't be traveling. And I think that was like, gift to the world, right? Because JP2's travels, like, I think meant a lot to a lot of Catholics that had been kind of irrelevant countries, and he would go out.
Right. When you have a Pope with a lot of personality and it's a great personality, it's a really good thing. If it's not a great personality, you're going to suffer. So he kind of brought the papacy a little bit back to being like more like an office. He also was foreshadowing his retirement, I feel like, from day one. Like he said he'd already wanted to retire. He was planning on retiring. And the thing that most surprises me about all this was he said when he retires, he wants to just pray and study. I feel like studying is what you do when you want to go do something, not just like, why keep studying when you're like 75 plus, Right. But that kind of really shows who he was. Yeah. You know? So then he becomes Pope. He does travel some. I remember he did at least one World Youth Day down in Brazil, Oh, and I saw him in DC, did you work that mass he did? We got to be like ushers at that, right? Yeah. At the Nationals baseball stadium, which was brand new at the time. And he did mass there. And that was very interesting. Kind of seeing who all comes. Like we were warned as ushers that like, there's going to be some weird people here. Yeah. And there's going to be people who like are on hospice who drag themselves to this mass and things are going to go wrong and it's going to be hairy, And it was, that was true. I remember I even have visual memories of like kind of how crazy that mass was. Like all the people who just desperately want to see a Pope,
Oh, yeah, that's coming back to me.
I remember there were these two guys who were wearing smocks like you would wear like in a kindergarten finger painting. And their smocks looked like weird Franciscan, it was like they were founding their own Franciscan order and they'd come to like go to the papal mass, like they were just like really kind of weird things going on. But anyway, so he did this, he did some encyclicals we'll talk about in a minute. And then he retired.
Yeah.
And I think that his retirement, he knew he was going to do that probably from the first day he became Pope. And he thought of that as one of his great theological contributions to the church. Maybe theology is a weird way to say it, because maybe it's something besides theology. I don't know, administrative or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. But he made it clear through that act that was very well thought out that you can retire.
Yeah, and which has never been done before.
I know, and I think he knew it needed to be done, not even for himself, but because he'd been through the final years of JP2. Yeah. And he knew that we can't just have we just can't.
We're also like in a different point now where an old person can live without their faculties for a very long time now.
Exactly. Right. So unless we're going to go through like 5-year periods of just like kind of having
or longer, function, really, or longer,
or a decade, we're going to have retiring popes. And I think he just logically knew that. And that type of change has to come from the top. It's not like a cardinal is going to go to the Pope and say,
you need to retire.
Retiring is okay, and you need to do it now,
Yeah, and then there's no road, in canon law for the cardinals to do that. Or I'm not saying there should be. I'm just saying that doesn't, to my knowledge, exist.
I think you're right.
It was interesting because, obviously, like that's a very simple explanation. There were a lot of rumors about why he retired. I don't know. I don't even know that.
We're going to talk about his legacy here in a minute. And we're going to have to talk about some of the rumors that happened. But one of the things I heard from reliable source. So he basically, when he retired, he ended up living at the Vatican in something that would have been like, it was an old monastery, but basically he lived in as if it was a house. And he had a household. And his household was one of the orders that's very dear to him. It's not really an order, but communion liberation.
Yeah.
Like there were dedicated
a movement,
celebrants.
like a
lay movement, right?
A lay movement. Yeah.
And Giussani is the founder of that. He did Giussani's funeral. If you ever want to look up a great, eulogy of Giussani, you should read what Pope Benedict said at Giussani's funeral. And he had people from that movement who he lived with while he was retired. And I know someone who is part of that movement who knew the people he was living with. And he said that the household wanted to figure out something to do on Saturdays, And so they went to Pope Benedict and they're like, hey,
community building, you mean? Or
I don't know what it was. I can't remember. That wasn't the key part of the story. But they were going to talk to Pope Benedict about something to do on Saturdays. And so they had this idea and they went up to him and they go, hey, how about if on Saturdays we do X, right? And Pope Benedict said, no, because what I do on Saturdays is I prepare my homilies for Sunday. And this blew this person away because he gave his homilies every Sunday to the 6 people in his household. Yeah. And it was like the fact that this guy was like preparing a whole day to give a homily to 6 people. Yeah. Was just like, I think that really sums up his idea that like when I retire, I want to study and pray. Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. And it's also interesting because it's not like he didn't need to do research or something, right? Like he knew so much, right? Right. Yeah. So let's go to that now, like kind of like where he stands and kind of his contributions theologically and to our understanding of church. So he is in this very interesting time period. This at Vatican II, post Vatican II, prefect of the doctrine of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Church, and then Pope, right? As we summarize this thought, I want to start with a quote that kind of like shows where his head was at quite a bit. This is from a small book he wrote called The Nature and Mission of Theology, which is a great book. Laura, do you want to go for this quote?
Sure. There are, of course, many petty minds and repeaters of the past, even among Orthodox theologians. They are to be found everywhere. Hack theology has enjoyed a particularly rapid growth, precisely where there was too much noisy chatter about creativity. For a long time, I shared the impression that the so-called heretics were really more interesting than theologians of the Church, at least in more recent times. Now, however, when I consider the great believing teachers from Moeller to Newman to Scheven, from Rossini to Guardini, or in our day de Lubac, Congarm, Balthasar, how much richer and more relevant is their testimony than the witness of those who let the corporate subject church slip through their fingers. These masters are a clear witness of another truth. Pluralism happens not when we make it the object of our desire, but when everyone wants the truth with all his power and in his own epoch.
All right, so he's labeling like kind of 3 groups of theologians here. He's labeling conservative theologians who are mere repeaters of the past, like parroting things. He's labeling what he's calling heretical, kind of liberal theologians who kind of were doing kind of interesting work, but were like rejecting orthodoxy while doing it, right? And then he says, and yet the most interesting group of theologians, the group that he himself belongs to, that I think the Communio Theological Journal is trying to embody, is this group that's both keeping the full orthodoxy of the church and engaging the modern world and, kind of.
Yeah, like kind of like plumbing the depth rather than pushing it like forward or something,
Right. Well, they're kind of finding answers to the modern problems while creatively working with the past, or I don't know how to, I tend to think of it as like synthesizing, Yeah. This is interesting. And I think this is kind of who he was. I also think this is kind of who JP2 was they saw themselves as like the people who are taking all the Orthodox truth that is in the history of our church and tradition, but not in some simple like retro way, like we need to think the same way we thought in 1750, but even going further back, like a Newman would have, like back to the fathers and seeing what the fathers would have had to say about our current moment in time and everything and being willing to change quite a bit, not the orthodoxy, but being willing to change all the accidentals of the church.
Yeah. I think this idea that like hack theology kind of arises where there's kind of loosey-goosey creativity is interesting. And I think the temptation to kind of latch on to like hack very clear theology is strong, right? For anybody that's kind of trying to be an Orthodox Catholic.
It's kind of reducing it's taking some mystery out of the religion and reducing it to an ideology. And ideologies are comforting because it's like, I have everything figured out. Done. Yeah. You know?
Yeah.
And I also think that, I shared this characterization of Vatican II when we did our traditionalism podcast. Mm-hmm. But to me, like, the church was a little bit stuck when Vatican II happened.
Right.
Like we were kind of doing derivative theology that wasn't kind of going back to scripture enough or the church fathers enough or broad enough, you know, and we were a little bit stuck and we needed to go back. In another quote, Pope Benedict says we'd quit doing theology. Yeah. He says like Guardini was a real theologian and barely could hold down a job pre-Vatican II. Yeah. And because all we were doing was kind of apologetics and kind of like just like maybe you'd call it systemic theology. Maybe that's misusing that term, but like we just weren't kind of getting back to the essence, you know? Yeah. And I feel like Vatican II like reopened up the sandbox, right? Mm-hmm. But because no one had ever played the sandbox, you got all these kids throwing sand, and these are like all these like liberal. They basically became heretics.
Yeah.
But it was also because you just dared them to go do something creative in the sandbox. And that dare like led to a lot of, they hadn't been well formed to become the theologians we needed.
Right.
After Vatican II, he must have been working on this during Vatican II. But after Vatican II, he publishes what I think of as his greatest work. Would you agree with that, Laura?
Introduction to Christianity?
Yes. Introduction to Christianity by Cardinal Ratzinger. It's still in publication today. It's like I feel like calling it his greatest work even doesn't do it, you know. Right. It's a very like kind of like Summa Theologica type of attempt,
like it's a monumental work. Yeah.
And when I picked it up when I've never, taken theology classes or what. And when I picked it up, I was like, oh, Introduction to Christianity. An introduction. That's nice. Yeah.
I think I picked it up. I think someone they must have not read it, said something like, oh, it's like a Catholic mere Christianity,
Okay. Which is completely mischaracterization.
Yeah.
The whole word introduction is like wild to me. Like when I started reading this thing, like I had to read every page 2-3 times. It is very clear.
When I read it, I would have to like make an outline of every chapter.
Right.
And not because it was confusing, but because there was so much, like every page had like 3 mind-blowing things, Right.
I often judge books this way now, like how many like really great ideas you get from the book, right? Yeah. And it's really terrible when you pick up a book that by reading the back cover, you kind of already got all the great ideas from the book. Yeah,
I think a lot of nonfiction right now could be pamphlets, but we're writing 120 page books instead, and it's painful.
And I think that's partly because that's what gets you on the like podcast tour or something like that, right?
Yeah.
But like when you read Pope Benedict's writing, he is a far better writer than Pope Francis and JP2, right? And I need to make fun of JP2 here because everyone disagrees with me on this. JP2 was a bad writer. He's a profound
I think
thinker.
The word people like to use was poetic.
Oh my gosh. Go pick up any JP2 encyclical or writing and just look at the paragraphs and count the number of sentences in the paragraphs. Many of his paragraphs are one sentence. Like they have clause after clause after clause. And it's because he wanted to caveat everything. You know what I mean? Like he would say, I mean this, but kind of like this and kind of like this and kind of like this. And then when you know that, then this. But I don't mean that totally. I mean this and this and this. And like Benedict's not like that. He's very clear. It's a very rewarding read. He is a great communicator, even though we had to outline his chapters because there were so many winning ideas. Like every page would often have 2 or 3 home run ideas on it.
Yeah.
So to me, like if I was to recommend one thing of Pope Benedict, anyone who wants to spend a lot of quality time with Introduction to Christianity, which should be called like graduate course in Christianity, should.
Yeah, but that's not the only one we recommend.
Yes. And well, wait, there's more.
Yeah.
And then there's the Catechism. He edited the Catechism. I don't know what more to say about the Catechism. I think most of the people who listen to this probably are somewhat familiar with it. So,
but I think I think the only other thing I would say about the Catechism is that it's shaped a lot of Simple House ideas, and we've spent retreat time with sections of the Catechism. We've discussed a lot, especially like the section on prayer.
My favorite thing about the Catechism is how much people talk about Catholic ideas that aren't even in there. Yeah. Like I call them extra catechetical beliefs, Okay. And like you'll get people who attack Catholicism and they're attacking something that's like not even a core enough issue to be in the Catechism. Yeah. Or you'll meet Catholics who will tell you kind of what's essential and what you really need to know. And they're telling you something that's not in the Catechism, Yeah. So I've always really valued it as just like the most useful, I don't know, reduction is usually a negative word, but it's like this, like, hey, here's the essence. If you believe this, you're going to be okay. Don't get too far from this. It also is like the best way to like say, what is the magisterium of the church, which is supposed to be this like guide for us all. I mean, the Catechism is the trustworthy summation of that magisterium. And if you're following, spiritual leaders who are going far beyond the magisterium, you should be skeptical of what you're following. You know?
But I think it's interesting that the Catechism, maybe people might have the impression it's kind of like a list of rules or teaching or whatever, but it can like be read as spiritual reading. Like there's
right.
Parts of it are very beautiful and moving.
So after this Catechism, I would say something that is worth reading is he has 3 book-long interviews. The later 2 are by Peter Seewald, and the first one is called the Ratzinger Report. It's from the 80s. It's the least known of the 3. And they're all very good, and they're not very good because they're going to theologically teach you a whole lot. I think they're really good because the interviewer is not completely antagonistic, but the interviewer is not afraid to push on Pope Benedict and on Cardinal Ratzinger, Yeah, the interviewer is both kind of like a collaborator in the book, but also like not a doormat, for the other person, He's like Peter Seewald is a journalist, and I can't remember like if he was Catholic or. I thought he converted after he did it, but he's just someone who believes in truth.
He wasn't like a practicing at the time of the interviews. He was coming from a journalism perspective. It was not like a softball interview. It wasn't antagonistic, but it was like all the hard questions were not avoided,
Right. And I thought that like when I read those interviews, I got an insight into how the Vatican works. Not that any of the questions were directly about that, but like you just kind of get the sense of like, these are he's had these conversations in the Vatican before, And I think too often Catholics like kind of create this like Platonic idea of what the Vatican and what their bishop and diocese is supposed to be. And then they like start critiquing their diocese based on that. And it would almost be more helpful if they like approach the diocese and the Vatican like a biologist would approach like an animal in the wild and just like study it for a while and just say, how does it actually work? And we do know it's blessed. And now like, now bring in your ideals and now try to figure out what would be better, Yeah. I feel like I have a lot of conversations where people have an unrealistic critique and an unrealistic ideal, and they haven't really gotten to what's going on. And I really hate talking church politics. And when you read these books, they're not really about church politics, but you kind of see
it cuts the crap.
It kind of is the mind of the Vatican in a way, because you're seeing Pope Benedict, who was both Pope and very influential in the Vatican for a very long time,
Yeah.
So these are great interview books and just entertaining. Like they were very easy reads, I'd like to now talk about 2 of his encyclicals that really influenced us. So he wrote God is Love, Deus Caritas Est, and Caritas in Veritate, Love and Truth. Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul II, is widely known for his theology of the body. He never put the theology of the body in an encyclical. He never like raised it to a teaching level like that. It's like a work that he just kind of authored on the side in a sense. And then now that JP2 is dead, Pope Benedict in his very first encyclical raises theology of the body up to an encyclical level of authority.
Yeah. The theology of the body, I think they were for a long time his Wednesday audience like homilies.
Right. But it's almost like it's almost as if.
But that's like a homily, right? Not teaching. Yeah.
Right. It's almost like JP2 was still a practicing theologian and the Pope. And he didn't take his practicing theologian ideas that he was working on and make them papal instructions.
Exactly. Right? Yeah.
So that's what Pope Benedict does. But this encyclical, God is Love, does three very big things. One, it does this, what we just said, but then also it's right after the September 11th attacks, or not that long after. And so Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism is huge in the world at this point, right? Like this is a big
he wrote it in 2005.
Concern. Right. So he's saying that, God is love, terrorism in the name of God is never okay. And Catholics have done terrorism in the name of God before. So we have to just he's just kind of setting out the standard that this is, you're off track when you're doing that, Yeah. And then he goes into the second half of this encyclical, which kind of goes a whole nother area he's tackling with it, which is he starts to argue that charity, and not the charity of, just charity love generically, but like literally the service of the poor, the giving of alms to the poor is constitutive of the church. And he very carefully makes this argument that from the very beginning, from the institution of the diaconate, where like the apostles like throw up their hands and say, we need some help. We can't be like serving all the widows and orphans and feeding people while trying to preach the word. And then their solution to it is to have 7 deacons. Right. And then he also notes that look at Stephen, the first martyr, who's also one of the first 7 deacons. When he dies, how he is so theologically expounding, while he's being martyred, right? He gives this like theological witness. So this is clear that these were not just do-gooders. These were like a theologically sound group of men who were doing the charitable work of the church. And he even points out that in the Coptic church, which is kind of like the Egyptian apostolic church that they believe they're founded on St. Mark, that they even call their leader the Pope, is my understanding. The Coptic church calls the charity of the church that comes from the chair of the bishop. This is an important concept. Simple House is not from the chair of the bishop. Simple House is a 501c3 of faithful Catholics who like to give to the poor.
Yep.
Chair of the bishop means that constitutive of the church, the bishop himself must administer charity. And in the Coptic church, it's called the diaconia. In the American church, it's called Catholic Charities. And part of the problem in this last 20th century was Catholic Charities was no longer seen as from the bishop. And even when I would talk to bishops face to face, I'd kind of confront them. I'd be like, do you like I was asking them, I thought they should reform their Catholic Charities to be more theological, also like more missionary based. Right. And they would say, well, I don't run that. I'd be like, I literally had this conversation with the bishop. I'm like, you don't run it? Like, I mean, do you he goes, no. There's a whole board of directors here. I go, do you appoint the board of directors? He's like, yeah, I appoint the board of directors. But so in essence, he owned it. He appointed all the directors of it. He probably even hired the CEO of it, but he doesn't run it, because he didn't want to be responsible for it, but it really is from the chair. Yeah. Right? And something also that Americans don't get, American Catholics, is all these Catholic charities are unique. Like your diocese Catholic Charities is not the same organization.
Yeah, they do different works.
Diocese.
They have different flavor. Yeah.
And there is a Catholic Charities USA that's more like a lobbying group. It's not really a from the chair in the same way. Yeah. Yeah. So to me, what he did there was he said, we have to be giving from the chair.
Yeah.
All right. So then the next encyclical came out built on that, and it was called Caritas and Veritate. So Caritas and Veritate is love and truth. Note that phraseology right there, because we always say truth and love, like meaning like give the truth in love. That's a true statement. Fine. It's also true that give love consistent with truth, right? And it's a more interesting statement. Chesterton has this cool quote where he's like, he said something to the effect of like, the conservatives have truth, but their truth has no pity. And the liberals have pity, but their pity has no truth.
Yeah.
Chesterton did not use the term liberal and conservative. I'm kind of reading back that onto him. But it's kind of the idea, right? So Pope Benedict in this encyclical, he literally says this, and I can't get any, I think that there's been a vibe shift towards what Pope Benedict said, but I can't, I keep saying what he said because I think it's so, I don't know if scandalous is the right word. It's so like, it's a real zinger. He said that we cannot be doing the work that a secular philanthropist could do.
Right.
Like if your Catholic Charities or your organization as a Catholic is doing something that any secular do-gooder would do, you are not fulfilling your vocation as a Catholic.
Right. Yeah.
And that's really important. You know, the nature of poverty requires a spiritual approach also. And we have, sold out our charities to be a secular approach that we almost think it's wrong when we bring in the spiritual while we're serving the poor.
Yeah. I want to comment a little bit on the early days of A Simple House when these were coming out. But at the beginning, especially, we all felt keenly that there was this like gap in the church, between the social justice Catholics and then like the pro-life Orthodox Catholics. And you, Ryan, and I had all been, in groups that were on both sides, and Simple House didn't actually really make sense to either side, So we felt like there was like a bridge to gap, and I think we thought that was important. And so when these encyclicals came out, it was like they were awesome, and
they were more, they weren't as much formating as they were validating, because we were already trying
yes,
to
I was going to say
they
gave confirmation, but they were validating. And I remember, this is no longer true, and thanks be to God, this is not true. But in the early days when I would kind of tell like peers from the like most conservative Catholic schools what we were doing, like as soon as I said the word poor, it was like conversation shut down. Like they were not interested in what we were doing. And they didn't have to like our ministry in particular, but they were not interested in charitable work for the poor because they thought it was just obviously going to be off track. And so so the God is love, it was like validating. And like, I also thought like it was going to be this great, like, yes, wake up, because the church is not doing this well. And on the other side, I think a lot of our more liberal friends had questions about like, oh, well, do you pray? Like, do you force people to pray? Do you force people to go to church, And so then the second one was really a response to this. And I think the second, I think they were both very challenging. I remember people were like, oh, God is love, so nice. I was like, there's a major challenge here.
Well, they were very challenging, but they also, that was the moment in my spiritual formation when I realized that no one reads encyclicals. And it's really wild. Like I was invited to talk at like different social justice events about the Pope's new social justice encyclicals, right? And I'd be the third presenter, and I'd listen to the other two presenters, and I would realize they hadn't read it. They were so on autopilot with their like social justice talks that they thought they knew everything from like whatever education they had, and they were just repeating them. And they didn't mention one unique idea of Pope Benedict that these encyclicals were bringing out. And when I would give these talks, by the way, so another piece of Simple House history that we're going to have to deal with later also in this podcast is we wrote a pretty big paper at this time that was arguing for re-spiritualizing Catholic charity, kind of what his second encyclical was about and how you could do that in a social work setting. That was the goal of that encyclical. Can we have a supernatural social work, right?
Yeah, but you're saying that these social justice guys hadn't read it. I remember at the time like hearing like summaries of the encyclical from like more like orthodox or conservative, to use that language, voices. And it was like, you literally just summarized the first half of this encyclical and left the other half out,
right.
Talking about charitable work for the poor being a constitutive part of the church.
They couldn't compute it. And part of it was that they were kind of taking a playbook from outside the church. They were kind of going, there was a little bit of modern progressivism being mixed in, And like, I remember one time I was asked in DC before these encyclicals, or maybe at about the same time as these encyclicals, to talk on like social sin. And I just kept thinking, like, they just assigned me this talk and they said, here's your topic, social sin. It was for the Just Life or I don't remember. Just Faith was the name of the program.
Just Faith. Yeah.
And I was like, I ended up responding to the guys being like, I don't know that I believe in social sin. I don't know what, and they go, oh no, big deal. Here's like, 7 pages by JP2 on what it is. So I read the 7 pages, and the 7 pages are primarily about what it's not and how it's not nearly as important as personal sin.
Yeah.
He does use the term, but like it literally was not making their point. And it was just like, these people are just not really reading.
Yeah.
There's something like so I agreed to give the talk, and then I gave the talk I wanted to give and told him, don't worry about social sin, worry about your sin.
Yeah.
Well, let me say this. So one of the weird things you learn is like, people don't read. Like people just operate and just don't read. But and that's always been discouraging to me because it means like, why write? Because given that like nobody's going to read it and it's not going to influence. But then you get in these situations where you talk, right? Like I've been in front of Catholic Charities people and in front of bishops and talked about Pope Benedict's ideas and the need for like a supernatural social work. And no one argues my points. No one disagrees with my points. And I know they heard me if they look horrified. If they look like if they don't look horrified, I don't think they actually heard what I said.
Wait, I wanna we spent maybe a year or so kind of digging into these Pope Benedict quotes and reading other, I don't know if Furphy, Saints in Social Work. Anyway, we spent a long time, and then you wrote a dense 25 page, paper basically.
That's good. So we did write, but okay. I missed my crescendo point I was making.
Oh, sorry. Go back.
I'd give these talks and some people got it and some people didn't, but no matter what, nothing happened. Like there were no follow-ups. There were no, it was just like, here's a job that would require you, to reinvent something. Yeah. Because it needs reinvented. Right. Yeah. And they can't even tell me why they don't want to. It just has to go silent and move on. And I feel like this happens with people. Like there's things that are true, that are inconvenient truths. And we just kind of hear them and they move. Yeah. They get ignored.
I heard this thing I don't know who this quote is from. It wasn't about church stuff, but it's easier to keep lying to people than to make them realize they were wrong or make them accept that they were wrong. This is not a church quote. This is something somebody, and I thought that was kind of true about human nature.
Right. So it kind of made me sense that so if writing doesn't get read and speaking the truth just hits deaf ears, they won't even argue with you about it. They'll pretend you didn't say it. Yeah. It's all, what that leaves is action. You just have to go do it. Yeah. Yeah. And I do still believe in that. And I do think you should still write and speak it, but don't put your faith in that. I feel like early in my, conversion, I thought I need to write the new Mere Christianity. I need to essentially update some of Lewis and Chesterton's work was my thought, and I even saw people trying to do it. There was that guy, there was a guy who wrote the new Screw Tape. He was a professor at Boston College, but it was kind of bad. It was Peter Kreeft, right?
I don't even remember it. So.
God bless Peter Kreeft. But the idea of just updating these old works just wasn't right. And I also kept noticing in my life that I would get into the library at the Newman Center or any library really, and discover the most amazing book that had been completely forgotten and had no impact. Yeah. And I knew that if I wrote the most amazing book, it could just end up in the library and having no impact. So And then you get someone like Mother Teresa who never wrote a book. Almost never wrote squat. Like we're just sitting around here with a bunch of quotes from Mother Teresa is all we have. And we bind them in the books. It'll say by Mother Teresa.
Yeah.
And the whole book is just quotes. You know, it's not, she never wrote a line.
I know.
And you know, Francis of Assisi, same way, never basically wrote a line. Like we have like an old rule of the order that maybe he wrote that and it's short, you know, but huge impact.
So you're kind of, we're saying two things. Pope Benedict's writings were really influential on a simple house. We read them. Turns out not that many other people read them.
That's true.
And
but very, and thank God he wrote them because they bring you through. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday and he was saying he felt kind of lonely in the church right now because he doesn't agree with, you know, kind of the liberal Catholicism and he doesn't agree with the hyper conservative Catholicism and he just doesn't know the way forward. And I kind of was like, and he kind of wishes something would happen where we'd see the way forward. And I was kind of like, so he wouldn't be so lonely. And I was kind of like, I kind of think that's just where you're at your whole life. Cause I felt that way when progressives ran the church and I felt that way now. And then you meet someone like a Pope Benedict, you meet him through his writings and they just help you, you know, they help you. Yeah. I'm contradicting everything I just said. This is why it's important to write, but like they give you this moment of solidarity where you realize, yes, clearly we're in the right. And I told that to my buddy too. I was like, there's tons of people who agree with you. They're not the vocal people. Yeah. You know, the vocal people are on the extremes. But there are many, many people agree with you.
Yeah. So, I know you don't like this book, but The Long Loneliness was a book that made me feel less alone.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's now, I feel like he's had the revolutionary introduction to Christianity, then the Catechism, then the interview books, which are amazing. And then we have the 2 encyclicals out of the 3. The other one's good too, but it's just not as important to us, I think, as these 2. And then he reinvents the world again with the Jesus of Nazareth books. These are very important. They're not just good books. They are good books, but they're more than good books. Yeah. What's going on here with these books is that the historical critical method of like analyzing the Bible came about like in the late 1800s, and it was like in German Protestant circles. And then the Pope, I think it was Pope Leo, threw down the gauntlet and said, Catholics, get on this. You know, like we're not afraid of history. The Bible is true at every level, historically, theologically, whatever, right? And then things went bad. So like,
it
love
was
the
kind
idea.
of used to kill the Bible.
Yeah, it was being used by the History Channel. It was being used to fight the historical Jesus who married Mary Magdalene, and you know, just like crazy, you know, ideas that weren't scientific, but they always dress them up as like the smart set believes this. Yeah. And these are very scientific that we know he married Mary Magdalene or something like this. And it's like, and they're always like making the supernatural a zero.
It starts with like, oh, you know, let's explain the context of what these coins mean and what this passage could mean, right? And then that's fine.
And then sometimes it goes to the multiplication of the loaves and fishes didn't happen. It was just soggy tuna fish sandwiches. Right. That's a Benedict Rochelle quote. He calls it, he always called the historical critical method on the multiplication of loaves the soggy tuna fish sandwich theory. But I don't know that everyone who wasn't exposed to this will get what this was. What this was they would take every story from Scripture and then try to ask like a reasonable person how it could have happened, how someone would have written that if they were really dumb and no supernatural act happened. And really dumb's part of it because you have to think these people are really dumb to have misrepresented all this stuff like this. Right?
Yeah. And wildly misrepresented.
And this became the highest form of biblical study. And it's complete trash. And it really corrupted the 20th century to the point that like, this is what our priests were trained in.
When I was at Catholic, I was going to be originally a religion major, and the Catholic U theology department has changed a lot since then. But so this was in the early 2000s, and I literally had a theology professor who was like a practicing Catholic, you know, explain with this method, like why the resurrection didn't actually happen and how it was misunderstood and misrepresented.
And the virgin birth didn't happen.
Yeah.
It was just an unwed mother who was in trouble. Forgive us, Mary, for saying that out loud. But that was like common, and it was even commonly being shared at like a parish Bible study as like the smartest way to believe, you know?
Well, and I think another thing is that the parish Bible studies, they weren't really, what has Jesus done in your life? It's like, let's understand really what happened in history, you know?
Yeah, and unless you've been through that I kind of associate with the 80s and maybe part of the 90s, that was the majority way things were going. Unless you've like witnessed that, you just don't realize how stupid and kind of like sad the whole thing was. And what Pope Benedict's doing with Jesus of Nazareth, he's saving the historical critical method.
Yeah.
He's taking it back and saying, how do we learn more about the supernatural Christ using historical data? And some, I had a great textbook I got. I can't remember the guy's name who wrote it, but it was a Protestant textbook about biblical Christianity in the early centuries. And it was great. It actually strengthened my Catholic faith the whole way through. But it was kind of doing exactly what Pope Benedict did. It used historical evidence to better explain and unfold the Bible, you know?
Yeah.
And so that is what the Jesus of Nazareth series is. Like, they're good standalone books, but they actually are a huge course correction for biblical research.
Yeah.
So definitely recommend those books. Even if you don't care about what I said, like you don't care about the history of scholarship.
Yeah,
of Scripture.
Forget about correcting theology. They're amazing, like faith deepening.
They're good on their own right, but then you realize he's kind of dunking on the abuses of the historical critical method. Then they're even better.
Yeah, it's like occasionally he'll quote like, you know, unlike Ronner would say, or unlike so-and-so would say, you know, but apart from, you know, the sort of scholarship of it, they are like, your faith can only be deepened reading these books. They're amazing.
Right. Let's now talk about his legacy. To me, his legacy is completely positive. It's what Laura and I just talked about, but he does have two different angles on his legacy that, or maybe three different angles that are not entirely positive. And I want to mention them out loud so that if you kind of like wax, what do you call it when you just
wax poetic? What?
Yeah, that's what I mean. If you just kind of like sing all the poetry of how great Pope Benedict is.
Layering on the poetry, is that the idea?
Yeah, if you lay it on thick like we just did, which he deserves. He deserves. God bless him.
Yeah.
Right. You're going to get some people throw some stuff back at you. Okay.
Yeah.
And the most notable one is when he was bishop, he shifted around some abusers, and then one of them got shifted to a orphanage or school for deaf children. And a lot of abuse happened there, and it was very tragic. Right.
Yeah.
And you know, if you listen to our church sex abuse podcast, which is a big ask because it feels like there's 6 hours of content there.
And it's depressing, some of it. Yeah.
Yeah. We try to be lighthearted about it and like view it with hope and faith, you know, but it's rough stuff, right? But like, essentially you need to know that all the bishops before, say, the year 2002 were inheriting horrible situations, and they all could be called complicit because almost none of them, and when I say almost none, maybe a handful, actually tried to like radically disclose and change and reform the church during that period. They were more like, it'd be almost like you taking over a job and learning about the crimes of the company and knowing you had to manage PR and also knowing you had to staff everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there also was just a great misunderstanding on what like pedophilia was. Like a lot of the research we did showed that like people didn't even know the term pedophilia till like the late 80s. You know? It just wasn't even it was so little discussed.
It wasn't just on behalf of the church that people misunderstood pedophilia. It was, this may have been a mistake, but the church was, you know, using a lot of modern psychology that thought you could rehabilitate pedophiles.
Well, yeah, and that's even afterwards. So there, at first there wasn't even an acknowledgement of what it was. Like it wasn't even in common talk. And then there was like false cures for it, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at the way like even secular institutions handled it, they handled it basically the same way the church did. All right. Having said all that, that means that if you were a pope before about 2002, people can smear you. And they do that to Pope Benedict. And they're not entirely wrong, I don't think. You know, like you almost wish everyone acted better back then. But
John Paul II also is implicated.
I know. And one of the things that relates to John Paul II was one of the abusers is the founder of the Legionnaires. And Pope John Paul II did not take that guy out of commission. And it was like the first thing Pope Benedict did when he came to power was to sit that guy down and take him out of commission. And maybe that has to do with the Parkinson's, like I said, that as, you know, in the later years, JP2, he may not have seen clearly enough mentally to do an act like that, right?
Yeah.
But that was as soon as Pope Benedict became Pope, the Legionnaires founder was decommissioned.
I think as soon as he became Pope, he did a lot of cleaning up.
Oh, right.
Type of
before he became Pope, and in the later days of John Paul II's pontificate, when he might have been advising in this, the great church scandal happened in 2002. Not the one everyone's remembering right now in Pennsylvania, but the Boston. You know, the real one in my mind. The Pennsylvania one was the unfortunate follow-up with a bunch of graphic evidence, you know, but wasn't actually new. He also, you know, is both working with JP2 and then in his own pontificate, part of this great reform that I think you and I have seen firsthand, that seminaries have gotten so much better in the last 20 years. Like it used to be in the 90s, you show up at seminaries and it'd be all guys who couldn't have gotten married, who were lazy, who were overweight, who were watching R-rated movies. And it was just kind of like they couldn't convince anyone to go to seminary, you know? Yeah. And so it was just kind of like you took what you could get, right?
Dregs. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't want to totally make fun of those guys, but like now you see motivated young guys who are handsome and daring and strong and big going to seminary, and they're bright and they know what's up. Yeah. And they like have their head on right, you know? Yeah. And they don't think they should be watching rated R movies together at night, you know?
Yeah. I mean, some of them do, but the last time I was in a seminary of like with diocesan guys, I had also recently been on a college campus, and I was struck by how like healthy and vibrant the seminarians all seemed.
Right.
In comparison, and that's not maybe an observation I would have made 20 years ago even.
Right. During the life of Simple House, we've been working with seminarians from like day one. We'll sometimes joke that we're like the favorite ministry of seminarians because we can't get college kids to give us the light of day, but all the seminaries love us. But like we've had seminaries we work with close down. Yeah. And they should have. Yeah. You know, like I'm very happy they closed down. They needed to close down. Yeah. And we just see quality going up. So it's great. It's great for the Life Church. And I think Pope Benedict deserves credit for that. Maybe not 100%, but he's a big part of that. So he's as much part of the solution as he was part of the problem, if that is
I do. After 2001, 2002, all those revelations, there were a lot of big changes were made, and they were in the right direction. And I remember that when he became Pope, it was kind of like there's still more. I think maybe I had a sense of like, what a horrible chapter of the church we can start putting behind us. And then when he became Pope, there was like more to be done. So, and then I think that's positive.
What else do you want to mention about his legacy?
You and I were disagreeing about his media portrayal.
Right. Go ahead.
I remember there being this like media portrayal that was widespread, that he was like a hard German, uncaring man, that he was like a bulldog and more conservative than, the real church. And I remember friends that were not Catholic being like, oh, this new Pope, and also friends that were Catholic. And I would have to be like, no, we love him. He's great. Yeah.
So my take is that where Laura and I really disagreed with this was the role of the media in this. So my take is that before Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, became Pope, very few people knew who he was, is my sense, right? Catholics knew who he was. He had kind of stood in the way of a certain progressive Catholicism. And so they knew who he was, and they badmouthed him quite a bit. And maybe that's where the bulldog term came from. But my sense is that it wasn't as much the media as like an internal church issue, And then I'm pretty sure if after he became Pope, people were like, ooh, I hate this new Pope. They probably read one article in Newsweek And that article had picked up on the bulldog thing. That's my sense of it.
There was a big thing that this was a thing that made the news before he was Pope, was he said that the church was essential for salvation. And everyone was like, this guy, right hand of the Pope, says you have to be Catholic to be saved.
Which is not the same statement, but how universalist weird do you have to be that you'd be upset that a Pope would say his church was necessary for salvation?
Yeah.
That's pretty messed up.
Yeah, that was before he was Pope. But yes.
But I also think he also just had the role in a sense of disciplinarian, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But in JP2's pontificate, right?
Yeah.
And unless you're a complete doormat, you will just be seen as a disciplinarian. I think bulldog, I just think no matter, if you were at your company or at your school or whatever, and you are the disciplinarian, unless you just cave constantly, you're just seen as a bulldog, just because you were given the job to bulldog,
Yeah. On a sentimental note, when he became Pope, I was like, it's I love John Paul II, and I lamented a little bit, he doesn't have that same, personality and awesomeness and whatever. And I remember telling myself a lot, every Pope is not going to be John Paul II. He was really special. And I saw Pope Benedict at an audience and was really up close to him. I was really overcome with his gentleness and meekness. And I've been seeing in a lot of reflections in this past week, people making similar comments about him.
Right. I think John Paul II was as big as the Beatles. His name is funnily even the first name of two of the Beatles, John and Paul, right? But basically he was like the Beatles Pope.
Yeah. When I saw him in person, and that was maybe before I was getting deep into his encyclicals, it changed my whole, I no longer lamented that he was not John Paul II,
Right.
Yeah.
So then the third thing that's kind of his legacy that I think, so the last two legacy things we said, we just kind of disagree with. We don't want him tarnished on the sex abuse crisis. We think he's more the solution than the cause. And then also we don't think the bulldog thing is a great caricature either. But then the other legacy issue is we're so fixated on liturgy right now that everyone is talking about efforts he made with SSPX and things like that during his pontificate. I just don't think that was one of the more important aspects of his pontificate or his life or his work. If you want to know more about that, though, those interview books are kind of interesting because one of the things that had happened was when he kind of blanketly gave SSPX more, I don't know what he did exactly, but he kind of more regularized their relationship with the church.
Yeah.
One of the big bishops in SSPX is a Holocaust denier. And you can tell that, this is, by the way, how you understand how the Vatican works.
Yeah.
Pope Benedict was mad, viscerally mad that they had, lifted the excommunication on that guy. I'm saying excommunication, but I'm not actually sure that's exactly what the ruling was.
He was excommunicated.
Oh, he was. Okay. But he was mad. And then he basically said, we didn't even Google him. We just had not done our research. We had not, we didn't look at what that guy stands for, what that guy says, and you could tell he was just mad at the dysfunctional processes within the Vatican.
Okay.
Related to that, that's interesting, where you and I have mentioned this before, is when Pope Benedict became Pope, you were reading these articles that he was reforming. And one of the things he was reforming was the Vatican Bank, right? Mm-hmm. And in case you guys don't know, the Vatican Bank was not following all the accounting rules. It was it
was corrupt.
It was corrupt at many levels. But but I want to say how it was corrupt because I think that matters, right?
Okay.
It was corrupt because it was not following the international standards for banks, which aren't just accounting rules. They're about don't take mafia money. They had a mafia problem within literal organized crime problem within the bank.
Yeah.
And they also had problems of giving money to people who work at the Vatican in ways that weren't going to get repaid. It was basically an unfair process also. Yeah. And so he was supposed to reform that. And, something that gives me some insight is when Pope Francis became Pope, it said he was going to go reform the Vatican Bank.
Yeah, we're like, didn't that happen?
I know. Like, we've been reading these stories about reforming the Vatican Bank and how much energy is being spent on it for a long time.
Yeah.
So somehow not everything he did was successful,
Yeah.
But that also just should give you insight on how complex the Vatican is. But all right. I think that's a pretty good summary of the great Pope Benedict, who's a fan of our podcast. He's now a fan. He only started listening recently.
Yeah.
So we had some new seminarians come to Simple House. It's been an honor, particularly at the KC House, it's more than 6-7 years. We've been having these two seminarians show up on a Greyhound bus from Denver each year. And they come for all of January and they come live with us. And it's their poverty immersion, which is part of the spirituality year. So this is one of the great reforms that's happening in American seminaries. And it's kind of recent. Denver, I think, was one of the first places that did it. Now I know.
So we have two guys from Mundelein.
The big change that's happening is like when you go to seminary, instead of them throwing you into classes to like academically pursue your philosophy, theology, they're basically giving you a year to be a monk. And they're calling it spirituality year. And basically you have no grades and you have no TV, you have no nothing. And you just sit at seminary.
No cell phone.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they put you on a Greyhound bus and send you weird places in twos in January. That's part of the spirituality year. And it's a great way that they're retackling spiritual theology in seminaries.
Yeah. Read
the classics in a great monastic setting. And it's an adventure. And the guys seem to like it, even though it adds like a whole year to formation.
Yeah.
So anyway, we got these two guys and every year they're great. I mean, like sometimes we get a weird one. We've definitely had to report a few seminarians in the past, but but like these guys have their head on straight. They seem to see what the real goal is. And part of my goal when I try to train them to do our mission work at Simple House is I'm also just trying to get them to think from first principles about why are we missionaries? What is the church about? What is the basics of the good news? Like, trying not to be silly about it, Is it about trying to get people to say the rosary or is it something else, So one of the questions I started with this year that was interesting was I asked, what is the purpose of the church?
This is like a really basic question, but we get a lot of seminarians that, people ask them what they're doing and they can't explain it, without jargon or with a way that means something to someone that's not, in the church.
You know how there's like via negativa where you almost have to study the errors in order to find the truth. Yeah. So the errors are all partially true, but they're never totally true. Yeah. So like, is the purpose of the church the worship of God? Then you have to explore that. Like one of the C.S. Lewis ideas is that if God just wanted us to be, worshiping, he would have made us a little bit more like robots, like automata is his word, is the purpose of the church just to the heaven and hell, like get people to heaven, save people from hell? Yeah. Or is it more? Is the purpose of the church to create a more just world? Or is that a consequence and not the purpose? Is it to make people more moral, sin less, or is it to improve virtue?
I think people get into these modes and I think they are incomplete and or wrong,
Right, right. Yeah. And I think you already recognize, like, even in saying those statements, what is the purpose of the church and giving these possible answers, you're seeing organizations, you're seeing thoughts you've had yourself where you got off track, right? Yeah. And it was interesting. These seminarians actually were quoting the Baltimore Catechism to me, which was good. They were not doing it in any weird way, but in a good way. And then the other thing, I think the ultimate answer to this, though, is I think the purpose of the church is eternal life, but not eternal life as we English speakers think of eternal life and eternity. But I think the right word would be infinite life. The purpose of the church is to create infinite life. Which to me is that you fully right now, it's not just the kingdom ahead of you, which is the kingdom of heaven, is the kingdom of God now in you in its completeness. Yeah. And the way that we create infinite life is love. Yeah. And it is through the receiving of love and the giving of love, but that can never be just human. You only are going to feel the infinite life if you receive the infinite love of God, because no human will give it to you in a high quality enough, And you're never going to live this infinite life unless you're also giving as close to the God love as you absolutely can, you know?
Yeah.
And then it gets even crazier that I think it's actually not just the giving and receiving of love. It is the indwelling of love, the being of love, the Holy Ghost, in a sense, cohabitating with you.
Yeah.
You know? I think this is consistent with the New Testament, but it's also like,
if you don't have like pity on your brother or sister, like you don't have the love of God dwelling in you, right? Or I'm misquoting that. But.
I don't even like pity, but you're saying you're quoting scripture? I'm trying to think.
Poorly quoting scripture, but
right.
Yes, it's.
I'm trying to figure out what scripture you're referring to, but.
All right, don't worry about it.
Right. But no, it has to be enacted. It has to be like received, enacted, and not even, it has to be being. It has to be like in you, cohabitating with you.
Ryan and I were talking about this because it's like, is the charity of the church a byproduct? And it's like, that's not quite the right word. And flowing from is maybe closer to, and then the word fruit is more, it's part of it, you know, it's part of the love of God. Like
everything
it's not
kind
separate.
of serves this, like the just world, the worship, all the other these kind of like statements that don't quite capture it are serving the infinite life, you know?
Yeah.
But it's also that like if you kind of like believe what we just are proposing here, it reinvents the whole way you view mission work.
Yeah.
You know, like if you view mission work with some limited or incorrect idea of what the purpose of the church is, you will end up doing a very different type of work than if you ground yourself in this other idea. You know?
I cheated a little bit. Not really. I looked at the Catechism about the church and it, like what the church is. And it talks a lot, like it used multiple times the images of like being in the family of God, getting, you know, brought into the sheepfold, and talked about proclaiming the good news, the kingdom of God.
Right. And I think also like the words of Christ have always been interesting to me in this regard, right? Like when people come to and say like, you know, what we really have to do is, you know, keep people from sinning in this way or do this or do this or this. Right. And it's like, if you just take Jesus at face value, that like what he's saying is the most important thing, is that where he put his energy?
Yeah, no,
you know?
Right.
It's like, no, you know, like Jesus did one mass. It was the Last Supper. He wasn't putting his energy into liturgy all the time, you know?
Right.
And so he also wasn't putting his energy in like correcting everyone's little philosophical problems.
Yeah.
And it's not that these things aren't important. It's just, they're not the core. They serve the core. They are not the core.
Yeah.
What's really important is can openers. I've noticed so the third member of our podcast, the one you rarely hear speak, sometimes he very narrates over us a little bit, is Ben. Ben is the third member of our podcast. And if you ever wonder why we don't have transitions, it's because Ben's not wasting your time. Ben does not believe in wasting your time.
Yeah.
If in the Simple Living podcast, you heard me go from refrigerators to V8 engines with no transition, it's not because that's the way my mind works.
I don't know about that, Clark. I worked with you for 2 years. I know all about your full and random and great thoughts. And also, I'm the one editing this podcast. I think I know a little bit about the derailing thoughts and offshoot topics. So I appreciate the shout out nonetheless. Back to not wasting your time, listeners.
All right. Laura, we have talked about doing a little bit more simple living stuff, even though we've said repeatedly that's not what we're about, and do the simple life hacks. All right. We got one for this week. What do we got? For those of you who are listening, she is holding up a can opener. What is special about your can opener, Laura?
This can opener really opens cans, and it feels really strong, and we abuse this thing. We are not good, loving stewards of this can opener, and it's still going strong since we got married. But this is the same can opener my parents have had since my childhood, and theirs is still going strong as well.
So you have a decade-old can opener that is still in its prime, and your parents are now 30 plus years into a can opener that's still in its prime.
Plus,
right. All right. Now, for those of you who are can opener aficionados, you will recognize the name of this can opener. This is the Swing Away Junior.
Yeah.
And this is interesting. Do not go out and buy a Swing Away Junior can opener, and I'll tell you why. After Laura and I got our Swing Away can openers, and Simple House made sure we got the poor Swing Away can openers, the Swing Away company, someone sold the brand to China, to a Chinese maker. And of course, they no longer are great can openers. But a St. Louis family went into the old Swing Away plant and bought the equipment that made the old Swing Away can opener. And they're now called the Easy Does It can opener. So here's the life hack.
Easy or EASY?
Easy. It's easy, DUZIT.
Okay.
Hopefully that
excellent.
doesn't bother anyone. The old one was called Swing Away because this is the company that made things that would, like, if you ever seen an old can opener that bolted to the wall and then you open your can and then you could swing it out of the way. But the one that became popular was not the wall hanging can opener, but the Junior, which was just the handheld can opener. So I've told so many people, like in my own family, about Swing Away Juniors, and they always hate it. They're always like, no, look at this XOXO can opener I have. It's so awesome.
Yeah. No,
look at the Chef So-and-so
it doesn't
can
compare.
Opener. It actually takes the whole top of the can off and takes the lip off for me. And it's like, that's kind of amazing. And in 3 years, it will not work. And maybe in 2 months, it won't work. And never buy a dollar store can opener. All right.
I think that OXO makes high quality things that are built well, but it doesn't compare. Just in the case of the can
This is
opener.
a whole nother level. Yeah, we're not slamming OXO as much as we are saying this is at another level. All right.
Yeah.
So here's the life tip. Do not buy one, buy a case. and not because you're going to need them, but because whenever anyone graduates high school, you can hand them one of these. And when people get married, you're doing them such a great favor. They'll thank you a decade afterwards, right? And if you hand them another one when they get married and they're like, you already gave me one when I graduated high school.
Success.
Yeah, you tell them that they can give that away. You say re-gifting. There's no shame in that. And we will take over the world with the Easy Does It's and the vintage Swing Away Juniors. Openers. All right. Now, I also want to throw out something else. This bothers me. I'm the only person in the world this bothers, but I hope it will bother you after I tell you. Imagine you are in a town like St. Louis and your family works at the Swing Away Junior factory and you guys have sacrificed to make great can openers, quality items your whole life. It's part of it's like what gives you satisfaction at your job. And then like so many things like Craftsman and all this stuff, that brand name is outsourced overseas,
Yeah.
And essentially the whole reason why they're still selling those things is because they're trading on the reputation you built when it was actually quality.
Yep.
And something is morally wrong with this. Like, it's not like if you have to move a factory overseas because you can't compete. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
But when you're just like taking a brand name that people have carefully sacrificed for and cultivated over all these years, and purposefully you're not going to make as good a product and you're going to trash it, there's something just wrong.
I really lament this in the case of the American Girl brand. Like the woman that started that was really wanted a high quality doll that kind of embodied good values, that had an educational, historical purpose that could help the girl like imagine herself in another time, in another situation outside her own world, and was like high quality in a sense to not like kind of anti-consumery because it was high quality. And she sold to Mattel. I mean, the company was eventually sold to Mattel, which has done, the opposite. And I lament that. I don't know, like kind of like good for her. You could sell this to Mattel. I don't know, but I don't know what to do with that.
I think a lot of those sales happen where they just say, oh, no, we'll do a good job. Oh, no, we'll honor the founder's purpose. And then they don't, because there's a lot of money to be made selling out a brand name, like cheapening the brand name. There's a lot of money. You can almost make more money doing that sometimes than by living up to the brand name. But there's I guess I get sad that like I think that manufacturing moving overseas can be justified, right? I think it's been way abused, but it could be justified. It's just like, you're kind of destroying people's life work sometimes. Like I was thinking about this, like your dad used to have a sign shop.
Yeah.
Right. if I'd bought his sign shop that he'd carefully been serving customers for all these years, I'm paying him for his customer base, for his name brand, for his reputation. I'm buying his reputation.
Yeah.
And if over the next 3 years, I decide the way I'll make more money is driving everything into the ground and cheating the customers, there's a moral problem there. There's not a moral problem necessarily at making a low quality item.
Well, where's the moral problem? Like, where's the...
I don't know. We need a moral theologian. I know there's a moral theologian who listens to this podcast. Can you write a paper on the moral problem of this? Because I'm convinced it exists.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of cheating people.
It is. I mean, it cheats a lot of people, but who's at fault? Is like the Chinese factory who bought it at fault? You know, the Chinese producer at fault? Like they saw a good deal. Like, I don't know.
I'm okay with them being at fault. I feel like the destruction of the legacy is just a problem.
I see it more as like sad than a moral problem, but I think that we kind of minimize the implications of this. Like, I think there's lots of examples in which like outsourcing, right? I agree with you that sometimes outsourcing to another country is a good idea, but we have these like empty factory towns with like, you know, fentanyl problems.
Well, there was this like great American sellout. And I remember when it was happening, you know, like before it was China, it was Japan. Like the America First movement in the late 80s, early 90s was about, you know, buy American, don't buy Japanese. Now it's a Chinese thing, right? Because China only opened up in the 70s and has gone from like, you know, starvation to skyscrapers, you know, since 1975, basically. But what I'm trying to say here is like when it was happening, we were thinking this is better. One, they need jobs, which is true, particularly in the case of China. They needed jobs. They were coming out of a very low level of poverty. Yeah. But another thing was that this would benefit us. And I even remember the economic arguments for it because that's what I was studying at the time. And I believed them, right? But now that I look at it, back at it, I see that it benefited the owners. So the ultra rich. It also benefited people who maybe had big stock market portfolios because maybe those Fortune 500 companies made more money by outsourcing it, right? And then it benefited everyone else in America who didn't have all that money in the sense that they got cheaper stuff at Walmart, right? Yeah. It's pretty clear that the cheaper stuff at Walmart did not improve the lives of the poor. Yeah. I think given that we took away their jobs, they got low quality stuff from Walmart.
We got rid of mom and pop shops.
Right. So it probably benefited kind of like the upper class. Essentially, our upper class sold out our lower class. And then they replaced every dollar you saved at Walmart, you spent in taxes to pay for welfare.
But there's maybe like there's a deceit in it, right? Because you think you're going to sell to this company and they're going to preserve your brand, your legacy. Like that's dumb. You are going to manufacture in China and you don't think they're going to rip you off by making cheap stuff based on your product. Like that's naive and dumb. And, you know, like,
I know we're triggering a lot of people right now because like whenever I talk to people like this, they're like, but there's some good stuff from China. It's like, yeah, there's good stuff from China when a foreign company is in there holding a high standard. You know what I mean? And it has to do with just like the Chinese expectation of quality is lower than the American expectation. There's even a name in China called chabuda, I think is what the Chinese word. It means good enough. And whatever they consider good enough is actually not what you'd consider good enough.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, but it's like we're trying to defend something that the other party has told us that they're going to do. You know, Mattel has told us by their actions they're always going to appeal to what, you know, and China by its track record has told, you know, I don't know. It's like, yeah, I'm sure there's some good products coming out of China or whatever. Mattel, like, I do think the American Girl stuff is still kind of higher quality than other dolls, but
what are you saying? What's your point you're making?
Like you can defend that there's some good products in China, but China has basically told us it cares about China. You know, it doesn't care about the legacy of your product, or it doesn't like it's like weirdly self-deceitful to defend something when the other party has already told us it doesn't care, or it's told us by their actions what they're going to do.
You're saying that people who are defending the outsourcing to China even now are in denial of just what China's shown us it will
do.
But
I guess when also you're trying to talk about sort of something immoral, and I'm like, well, I don't really know who the moral fault lies with.
I'm talking about social sin, and I already earlier in this podcast said there are no social sins. But
and I'm saying that there's something. It's like.
Oh, you're saying you should have known better. Like when you sell American Doll to Mattel. You should have known better,
and that you're dealing with
right,
a kind of dishonest party. Like if I don't know that this happened, right? But if Mattel tells you they're gonna preserve your legacy, like that's obvious bull.
Yeah, the part of the problem is it's not a repeat game. So it's like if you build a company, you're only going to sell one company usually in your lifetime, maybe two. But like,
totally.
So like by the time you've learned your lesson the hard way, you don't have more companies to sell.
Yeah, I don't fault like you build a company and then you sell it off for like might even say that's the smart thing to do. I'm not trying to say that's wrong.
I think we're wandering too much. I guess a little bit. What I want to say is that this whole Trump America thing and this like populist revolution is because of this.
Yeah.
Like what we're talking about very kind of theoretically about the outsourcing of these jobs is exactly what's motivating American politics right now and creating new voter bases, you know, and there was kind of deception there, and I think the deception was when the upper classes kind of controlled the narrative and said, this is good for everyone. Even though you're losing your job right now, on whole, it'll be net good that we're going to quote a service economy, that our main thing we produce in America is middle management for multinational companies, and that our welfare rolls are going to go up, but it's good for us because on some net economic way, we're going to actually have a higher GDP, but it's just actually at the end of the day, not good for us, not good for our communities. It's not. And as an economist who's a free trade economist, that is hard for me to want to say out loud, but it's true,
Yeah.
And then I also see just the sadness of like really quality things that I know people took pride in now being sold, ripping people off under the same brand name.
Yeah.
And kind of betraying the work and the legacy of the people who made it that high quality.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, all right, there's a lot of rambling in there. Ben, we trust you to make us look smarter than we are, and we'll talk to you later.
All right, see you, Clark.
Everybody send us comments and suggestions, particularly for our new simple living hack idea. So God bless. Talk to you later.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.